Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads. So great to be with you today, again in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Such a pleasure and a privilege to have you along for the ride today. My Ask This segment, if you have not done so already, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, as well as the Washington Examiner's channel, youtube.com/Washington Examiner. You can keep tabs on all the great content that we've got cooking up for you today. In the next segment, we're going to have our panel on election integrity efforts in various states across the country. And I thought it would be pretty apropos for a lead-in that covers two different distinct areas. One is concern over the 2020 elections. The other, I think especially pronounced here, is the idea and the concern about cancel culture in academia and elsewhere. I've got two guests today that I'm very pleased to introduce in a moment. One of them spoke at the rally on January 6th that happened at about the same time as the incursion on the U.S. Capitol was happening. A few weeks later, this guest, Dr. John Eastman, went on CNN to talk about his experience and give his thoughts on what happened. Here's a little taste of his speech and that exchange with Michael Smerconish from CNN.
We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question. This is bigger than President Trump. It is the very essence of our Republican form of government, and it has to be done. And anybody that is not willing to stand up to do it does not deserve to be in the office. It is that simple.
What responsibility are you prepared to take for those words as being incitement to that crowd?
They don't even get close to incitement to that crowd. The standards set out by the Supreme Court in Brandenburg versus Ohio is not remotely close to what I said. And let's put that statement in context. We're talking about asking the vice president to delay the proceedings enough to exceed the requests from hundreds of state legislatures who had notified him that their electoral votes had been certified in violation of state law, and to give those legislatures a few days, now that they were back in session, to review the illegality that had occurred and to determine whether it had an effect on the election.
That speech at the Capitol was used as the pretense, at the very least, for the University of Colorado to demote, suppress, how would you define it? Dr. John Eastman, who was the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the Bruce D. Benson Center for Western Civilization at the University of Colorado. And I am so pleased today to be joined to talk about what's going on here by Dr. John Eastman, law professor, and his attorney, Randy Corporon, also radio host on 710 KNUS. We both share Saturdays on KNUS. And in full disclosure, because we are talking about a law thing, Randy gave me my first job at his law firm out of college, although it's been a few years since I last worked there. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for having me on the program.
Thank you, Jimmy. I'm starting to get over those several years at the law firm with you.
It takes a long time to get past the aura of Jimmy Sengenberger working for anybody. I know, it's incredible.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
I want to break down some of the facts here and get to the basics of the matter. First with Dr. John Eastman, as far as how things developed, how you got the role at the University of Colorado as a visiting scholar for the 2020-2021 year. And then we'll go to Randy afterwards for a discussion a little bit more, and of course, John, on the topic of the legal case, because you've sent a notice of claim, getting ready to file a claim. Professor Eastman, how did you find yourself working at the University of Colorado as a visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the Center for Western Civilization?
Well, a number of the former visiting scholars had suggested I apply for it. The job application says they're seeking somebody who's with national profile in the conservative thought scholarship or practice of conservative policy. And so I announced in my job application that, my scholarship on birthright citizenship, on constitutional federalism and separation of powers, it was not only among the leading scholarship in the area, but also was having real world implications in revisions of Supreme Court precedent, and looking back at and reviewing reviewing our understanding of the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. So I said this job was perfect for me. They agreed. They had me out and gave a job talk on birthright citizenship. And then they offered me the position. And when I was asked by Newsweek in August of last year to apply my longstanding scholarship on citizenship to Kamala Harris, all hell broke loose. They started at that point looking for a way to fire me, but didn't. And then when I represented President Trump before the Supreme Court, they started a renewed effort looking for ways to fire me. And then when I gave the speech on January 6th, they canceled all my classes, and then within a week they had prohibited me from engaging in all my other duties on campus. Now, I just got to point out how ludicrous the claim is. That same one on the CNN clip you played earlier, that my little 3-minute speech an hour before the president's incited people to leave the White House and the mall in front of the White House and go down and cause an insurrection at the Capitol. 500,000 people who had flown in from all over the country to hear the president speak were so incited by my talk that they left without hearing the main event. I mean, it's laughable, these claims that the university made, and yet there we are.
Now, a moment ago, Dr. John Eastman, I showed the clip, and let's put it up again, from 2019 when you spoke on this issue of birthright citizenship at the University of Colorado before you were offered the position. And I wanted to show this because in that August article that you wrote, the controversial piece for Newsweek, where you raised questions about now Vice President Kamala Harris, then the nominee for Vice President of the United States, you gave this talk well before then. Talk to us about that relative to your position and the things that came about after that 2020 article.
Well, one of the things that I was accused of is making up this new theory because I was racist, because Kamala Harris's parents were from India and Jamaica, and therefore she's a woman of color, and I only made this theory up because I'm racist. This was one of the false defamatory claims that were made against me. The fact that I had been doing this scholarship for 20 years was known to some of the people that made that claim, because they were the ones that reviewed my job application, and they were the ones that were present in the room when I gave the talk a year earlier. So it's just false. And by the way, that was the standard for defamation in the United States is very high hurdle. If you're a public figure, you got to prove not only was it false and knowingly false, but maliciously false. But I got a similar defamatory note copied to the president of my home university, Chapman University, claiming that I was a racist because of this position. He was from the London School of Economics, and I pointed out that the First Amendment law on defamation is more favorable for the victim of defamation there. And within the return email, I had an apology from him, acknowledging that, in fact, it was false. But in America, the standard for defamation is a little higher, so people are able to say defamatory things almost with complete immunity and impunity.
Dr. Eastman, I have one more question for you before we shift gears and talk a little bit more about the specifics of the legal matter. In terms of the timeline, when did you find out that you weren't going to be teaching classes and figure that out? And how did that tie in with the events at the Capitol? And also, if you could dovetail that in with what happened at Chapman University, where you agreed to resign following the January 6th events.
Right. So I spoke on January 6th. That afternoon or evening, the next day, January 7th, the chancellor of the University of Colorado sent around a defamatory note campus-wide to the press, to the alumni of University of Colorado, claiming that, calling my statements on the 6th repugnant, because I had no foundation for them. Now, he had never reached out to me to say, what kind of evidence do you have to support the things you've said? I said election officials in a number of the states ignored or violated their state laws, election laws. That's demonstrably true. I said we've got dead people voting, and I've got sworn affidavits in Georgia and Nevada and elsewhere confirming that by expert analysis. And then I said the audit in Michigan had indicated that the machines can store ballots. I called them a secret folder. The actual manual calls them a suspense folder. Those ballots can be uploaded and stored and then utilized as necessary. And that my expert team had seen it happening live on the Senate runoff in Georgia. So those were the three things I said. The chancellor didn't bother to reach out to me and ask if I had any evidence to support it. He just said that I had no evidence. That was at least negligently false. I then immediately sent a note to the head of the Benson Center, who's my titular boss. And I said, I want you to know I've got sworn testimony for every statement I made or expert reports. And he then sent out a note campus-wide saying that I did all of this stuff without any evidence. So that was no longer negligently false. It was knowingly false. But he also said that he was going to cancel my classes and shift everybody into independent study, which was unfortunate, but the students and I could make do. The day before classes started the following week, though, I'm locked out of the class system altogether, and the provost sends me a letter saying, we have canceled all of your classes for under enrollment, they claim. And that's significant because there were 120 other classes offered this past semester, same semester, in the same College of Arts and Sciences, lectures and seminars, not specialty labs or externships or anything like that. 120 classes with enrollments at or below my enrollment. And so it's completely pretext. And what that means is they retaliated against me by suspending me from my duties. That's an adverse employment action, albeit with pay, but they suspended me. That's an adverse employment action in retaliation for my representation of the President of the United States. It's stunning.
Dr. John Eastman, can you just tell us, since you said that the university didn't ask you for any sort of evidence, what kind of evidence do you have that would have been presentable to the university had they asked?
Well, and we had a press conference on April 29th when we announced my legal team was filing a notice of claim, and we put a press pack together that included links to the evidence that we had at the time. It's gotten much bigger than that. But at the time, I have a litany of laws in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in the country that were violated by state election officials in violation of Article 2 of the Constitution. That was in my Supreme Court briefs in both the Texas case and the Pennsylvania case when I was representing President Trump. I had the expert reports in Georgia and in Nevada where they had analyzed how many voters were on the Social Security Death Index. And in Nevada, the claim there was under oath was 1,506 dead voters. And then we've got sworn affidavits by experts in Georgia and in Michigan dealing with the machine issues. So all of that was available had anybody asked. And of course, that was way back in January. We're 4 months later now, and the evidence just keeps mounting of the illegality, and the statistical disparities that are just beyond nature to have happened.
Dr. Eastman, your tenure ended on May 7th. Was that when your contract was up?
That's when my contract was up.
Okay,
yes.
So that's why you're now a former visiting scholar. But until that point, you were unable to teach your classes, access Westlaw, and so forth. I want to put up, as we switch over to Randy Corporon, attorney at the law offices of Randy Corporon, I want to put up a image here that showcases some of what the University of Colorado said in a Denver Post article on April 29th. Put it up. Consistent with First Amendment principles in the university's policies, Professor Eastman is able to speak on any subject he wishes and pursue his scholarship, CU Boulder spokesman Andrew Sorensen said. The university has taken no action that would deter a reasonable person from engaging in free speech. The university, however, is not constitutionally obligated to have him serve in any representational capacity when he exercises his right to free speech. Professor Eastman was not suspended. The College of Arts and Sciences canceled his spring courses for low enrollment in accordance with its policies. Provost Russell Moore appropriately relieved him from performing outreach functions on behalf of the Benson Center because his continued performance of those duties would likely cause disruption and harm to the center. Randy Corporon, what is your response to that, and what is the notice of claim that you sent entail, and to whom did you send it?
Sure, Jimmy. And I just want people who are new to this story to think about the scope of what we're talking about here. One of the premier universities in the world has one of the premier constitutional scholars in the world on their staff as a visiting scholar who represented the President of the United States, is in the midst of one of the most important controversies in American history. And rather than hear him out, rather than discuss or get into open forums and let the students hear and learn and participate in sorting through what's true and what isn't, they canceled him. The response that they put into the Denver Post, some of that will have to come out in court. But the idea that there wasn't retaliation, the idea that they provided any due process at all, constitutional or procedural or otherwise, to Dr. Eastman is pretty easy to disprove. And so the fact that they paid him his salary seems to be the thing that they're going to hang their hat on when we get to our lawsuit. But it's going to be very, very interesting for them to explain why they cut him off from his legal research funds and why they refused to let him share his opinion in any fashion related to the University of Colorado or the center. With regard to our suit, in Colorado, you have to provide 90 days of notice to any state entity like a hospital or a police department, or in this case, the University of Colorado, a state university, prior to actually initiating the lawsuit. So we provided that notice on April 29th, and now CU has 90 days to ignore us, to respond to us, to talk with us if there's maybe a possibility of resolving these claims. And once that 90 days is up, I think that's July 29th, then we're free to move forward on our lawsuit. And I can certainly go into some of the details of our claims if that's what you'd like me to do next.
Yeah, I understand that it seems like from reading the notice of claim that there are two legs to it. One is the defamation piece, and that's where most of the monetary damages come from. And then the other addresses the contractual issue in terms of him being denied the ability to do his classes, to access Westlaw services, and so forth. So briefly, just touch on those two legs.
Well, I don't know that I'd agree with you that defamation is the majority of damages. These constitutional violations are significant and severe. And the only way to stop that kind of behavior from an institution like CU in the future is to force them to write a big check. The claims that we're bringing include defamation, of course, but also have other very serious claims: breach of implied duty of good faith and fair dealing, retaliation in response to constitutionally protected speech and acts, violation of administrative and constitutionally protected due process, violation of their own policies. Jimmy, I should have sent you a link to the University of Colorado website that talks about what a safe place they are to have open debate and free speech. Yeah, you got it. I didn't need to send it to you. Freedom of expression by University of Colorado faculty. When engaged in teaching and research, faculty enjoy the associated rights and observe the associated responsibilities of academic freedom as expressed in Regent policy. And if people read that second paragraph, man, oh man, I look forward to seeing how CU defends themselves against canceling Dr. Eastman in the middle of his tenure as a visiting scholar.
Well, and let me add, look, they have a prohibition on university policy against discrimination on the basis of, among other things, political affiliation and political philosophy, and they've been very proud of that. In fact, they get green status with the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. That's the high level for diversity of opinion and thought. One of the very reasons the Benson Center exists is to provide a counter viewpoint. But there is no question notion that they took these actions against me in retaliation for my political expression and my political representation. And let me, I'm one of the leading scholars in the country on the question of birthright citizenship. One of the key scholars in the country on the question of separation of powers and the relative role of the federal government versus the states. They tapped my expertise and my significant network of colleagues around the country to organize a lecture series, and then they barred me from introducing the lecturers that were only coming because of my connection with them. I mean, the notion that this wasn't retaliation is pretty preposterous.
Well, so let me ask you this question, Dr. Eastman, and also Randy, feel free to jump in on this too. Do you think that they fired you because of what you said and they just disagreed with it, or because they believed that you were perpetrating falsehoods?
Well, it doesn't matter. Under First Amendment right. Look, the way the Supreme Court has set out First Amendment rights, the idea of protecting even false speech is because in the crucible of speech, you get to the truth. Maybe everything I said was false, but how are we going to know that if nobody's allowed to contest it? If I'm not allowed to rebut their opposition, whether in an adjudicative process, adversarial process in court, or in an academic setting with an adversarial process or point and counterpoint, that's how we get to the truth, through the crucible of that mix up in speech. And to shut down one side of the speech is almost a guarantee we're never going to get to the truth. And one suspects at some point that they fear what the truth actually is. Look, if I were Joe Biden, and I said this way back in December, I'd be the first one out there calling for full forensic audits of the election. Because if I won, I want the American people to know that, instead of being under this dark cloud that the election was stolen. And yet you find on his side of the aisle, every single effort to shut down subpoenas, to ignore subpoenas that are issued, to bring bar complaints against the lawyers that are representing the cases, to see things like this at University of Colorado shutting down my speech. Why are they so afraid to hear the evidence or the other side? But the Supreme Court's been very clear.
Sure.
The counter to false speech is more speech. So if indeed what I said was not true, and by the way, it's not, it was true, but if indeed it's not true, the counter to that under the First Amendment is counter speech. We have never had the opportunity for that at the University of Colorado or elsewhere.
Randy Corporon, feel free to piggyback on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, Professor Eastman's right that it doesn't matter for purposes of the lawsuit whether it's true or not. But for purposes of public policy, for purposes of your viewers to understand just how significant what's happening is, this is one side of the political spectrum that has, in concert with mainstream media, local TV stations, national TV, radio, elsewhere, is doing everything in their power to shut down the discussion about investigating the election. Even after spending 4 years claiming collusion for Donald Trump and Russia, that was a story every day for months and months and months. But we can't even investigate what happened in this very significant presidential election. So the idea that a university like CU would make that political conclusion, you cannot doubt the integrity of a man like Professor Eastman, believing sincerely what he is presenting. This is a man who started his career clerking for United States Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who has been dean of law schools and taught many law school courses and been involved in critically important cases. They shut him down because, and you see it everywhere, any news story, it says the unfounded allegations of election fraud. Well, they are founded. They're continuing to be investigated. And these universities and news outlets don't want anything to do with it.
So you and I, Randy, as you know, do have some disagreements on the extent to which there are founded claims in terms of what happened in the election. But what catches my interest here is not that this is so much about the idea of whether or not there were issues with the election and to what extent there were problems and in what ways, but it is that speech aspect here that we are seeing all across the country, as you're alluding to in social media, when it comes to when it comes to college campuses, and now the military, even with a lieutenant colonel being demoted from the Space Force, in the Space Force, because of something he said about Marxism. We're seeing this all over the place, and that's what particularly catches my interest here. But there is one sort of case study that I'd be curious your thoughts on, Randy Corporon, as the attorney on Dr. Eastman's case, one of the attorneys. And that is the Ward Churchill matter of a number of years ago when I was in high school. He was a professor, tenured professor at the University of Colorado, who was fired and brought suit, and he wasn't successful in that suit. And part of the case was on the issue of defamation, and they said that the university folks, particularly the regents in the administration, the CU Board of Regents that oversees the university, the elected board, had qualified immunity in that regard. Does that apply here? How would you take that Churchill matter of over a decade ago and apply it to this circumstance?
Well, I got to tell you, Jimmy, one of the great honors of being a part of this case is working not only with the team that we're putting together for Dr. Eastman, but working with Dr. Eastman himself. His scholarship on these issues is far better than mine. I'll just turn that question over to him.
Yeah, Jimmy, it's a great question. Look, qualified immunity protects government officials when they are taking actions that are not violating clearly established constitutional rights. It is clearly established beyond peradventure that you cannot retaliate against somebody for their exercise of free speech. The university retaliated against me for my exercise of free speech. In fact, they even admitted in the chancellor's opening salvo, his letter was a response to a faculty petition of nearly 800 other faculty members and graduate students demanding that I be fired. And he said, I can't do that. That would violate his constitutional rights to free speech. And then they did that anyway. I mean, they didn't fire me. They just demoted me or suspended me with pay. But it's still the same adverse employment action. And it's still the same constitutional violation. And the law is clearly established there, which means they don't get qualified immunity.
Although the reason why I raised the question is that Churchill, as I recall, was fired because of speech that he had used.
Well, no, what they wanted to. They didn't fire him for it, but the high profile, the intense scrutiny that speech brought to him, they started looking at his scholarship, and they found lots of evidence of plagiarism in his scholarship.
Oh, that's right.
And he was fired for that. And he had all sorts of hearings. He had all the levels of due process you want, none of which were given to me.
That's a distinction, Randy Corporon, I'd like you to address, which is the idea of due process in this particular matter of Dr. John Eastman and the University of Colorado.
Well, Jimmy, there's hardly any distinction to address at all, because as opposed to the hearings and the appeals that then can come from administrative hearings within the school system, when it came to Professor John Eastman, Dr. John Eastman, the full extent of his due process is, hey, we don't believe you. We're going to tell the world that we don't believe you, that you're spreading unfounded rumors and alleging facts that aren't true, and we're going to interfere in your ability to do your job. There was no hearing. There was no, as you heard Dr. Eastman say at the beginning, he responded immediately to the first email that was sent to him and said, I've got loads of evidence. They didn't want to hear it. So there was no due process afforded that I've been made aware of so far. And we've already got thousands of pages of communications and different things that establish it doesn't even seem like due process was discussed.
We're going to be wrapping up here now with our guests, Dr. John Eastman and attorney Randy Corporon, one of the attorneys representing Dr. Eastman. I do want to throw up Eastman 4, which lays out the damages that you guys are requesting, looking for, hence this notice of claim. And they have, of course, now less than 90 days to respond. But you can see you're looking for a nearly $1.9 million in compensatory damages. Randy, can you talk about that breakdown for a moment?
Sure. There was about $20,000 that were provided to Dr. Eastman in what they call a startup research account, which allowed him access to Westlaw and other extensive legal databases. He was precluded from accessing those once they shut him down. The $1.85 million is calculated by taking the 10 years until his retirement age of 70 at the $185,000 contractual salary rate for harm to his reputation. And then that number can go up from there with, of course, interest and punitive damages, which can be significant if a court or jury determines that his constitutional rights were violated the way that we believe they were. And then in a federal lawsuit like this, the winner can also recover their attorney's fees and their costs, which I expect to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in this case as well.
Dr. Eastman, a final word from you, sir.
Well, look, I'm in a position to be able to push back against this. Yes, my constitutional rights were violated, and I'd like to vindicate those and restore some semblance of my reputation as a result. But there are a lot of students and junior faculty members on campuses all over the country that are self-censoring themselves for fear that they'll get caught up in the kind of controversy and cancellation that I'm caught up in. And so it's on their behalf that I'm pushing this. But also the students on campus, as Randy mentioned earlier. I mean, I was brought here to provide an alternative voice to campus in both the scholarship and the actual practice of conservative thought. I did that job beyond anyone's imagination. When the President of the United States asked me to represent him, the students should have had an opportunity to hear that. The university could have been the forum where these issues were debated in public that the whole world would watch. And instead they reacted in joining on this cancel culture bandwagon to shut down speech and to prevent access to the truth for the students, for the community, for the state of Colorado, for the country, indeed for the whole world. And I think I'm in a position with this lawsuit to start pushing back against that kind of nonsense.
Jimmy, if I may, very
Go ahead.
quickly, there was massive cars going by, during the press conference. Vast majority were supporting, honking, shouting. A few detractors, of course, a few expletives, and that sort of thing. But it was really significant to me, two different women, one during the press conference, one after, who came up to me and asked, "What is this about?" And I just explained in a very basic way how Dr. Eastman had been precluded from speaking about these very important issues he was involved with. And both of those young ladies, college students at CU, just shook their head. And one of the comments was, "We should always have free speech here on our campus." I think it's a losing issue for CU, and I hope they do something about it very quickly.
We will see what happens, especially once they do respond in whatever way to the notice of claim. And of course, you will be filing. Around what time would you expect to file a lawsuit if they don't say, "Hey, here's an offer" or something to address this?
The earliest we could file is July 29th. I can't see any reason why we would delay beyond that date unless there are some conversations ongoing with CU that are worthy of pursuing before we file in court.
Well, I will be watching this case with great interest because, of course, the University of Colorado is in my home state of Colorado. And, of course, Randy, we are colleagues on the radio, and I know you quite well. We have known each other for over a decade now, which is pretty crazy to think about. And, Professor Eastman, I remember hearing you on Hugh Hewitt's show, and you definitely have been around the block for quite a while in legal matters. So I'm going to be watching this with great interest. I believe that overall, Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States, but there are irregularities, there are issues of concern, and certainly we should have free speech and the ability for individuals like yourself to speak out about topics of interest, of import, especially when you were an attorney representing the president of the United States in election lawsuits. So best of luck to you both, and I appreciate the time today.
Thank you very much, Jimmy.
Hang on to your hat, Jimmy. There's a lot more evidence coming your way. Thanks for your time.
We'll see what happens, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Once again, Dr. John Eastman, former attorney for President Trump in his election lawsuits and former visiting scholar for conservative thought and policy at the Bruce D. Benson Center for Western Civilization at the University of Colorado, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, as well as his attorney, Randy Corporon, also, of course, my colleague at 710 KNUS Radio here in Denver. And let me just say, to me, this isn't an issue about the election and whether it was stolen or not. I don't believe that it was. Certainly, there are things that we need to be looking into to suss out, to address, and there are election integrity efforts. We're going to talk about it with our panel in the next segment that are underway in states across the country to shore up the integrity and security and confidence of our elections. But this isn't about that. This is about freedom of speech. Did the University of Colorado have grounds to strip Dr. Eastman of any of his duties? That's a question that they're going to have to address. And I think it's important to talk about it and to have this situation put out there for discussion, because it's happening all across the country.